I'm Michael Krasny, and I welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. And you can stream us live at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Fridays when we include your questions and comments. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode, we talk to investigative journalist and author David Cay Johnston, a specialist in economics and tax issues and a winner of the 2001 Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting. Former columnist for Reuters and president of investigative reporters and editors, he has written for a number of newspapers, the Los Angeles Times, Detroit Free Press, Al Jazeera, English in America, San Jose Mercury News, New York Times, and he's a distinguished visiting lecturer at the College of Law and the Whitman School of Management at Syracuse University, at least until recently, because, congratulations, he was just named professor at Rochester Institute of Technology. He's educated at University of Chicago, Michigan State, and San Francisco State, and has a number of books. Let me mention a few of them. Temples of Chance, that's all about American casinos. Also wrote a book called Divided, The Perils of Our Growing Inequality, and a few books about the new nominee for the Republican nomination for president, Donald J. Trump, whom we'll talk about. The making of Donald Trump, it's even worse than you think, what the Trump administration is doing to America, and the big cheat, how Donald Trump enriched himself and his family. I welcome David Cay Johnston to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny.
Well, Michael, good to be with you again.
I'd like to begin, since I said we're coming live now, and last night Trump became the nominee of the Republican Party. It remains to be seen whether he will be facing Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. But certainly RFK Jr. is in this, and so are a few other people. When did you decide, I'm interested in just the genesis of this, to be the nemesis or the bête noire of Trump, because you have been that for a number of years now.
Well, in 1988, I left the Los Angeles Times, where my investigations a number of years earlier, the LAPD and some other powerful forces in LA, made me very unpopular with the editors there, who were not particularly strong-spined. And so I left to go to the Philadelphia Inquirer to cover Atlantic City because I believed casino gambling was about to spread across the country, which it did. And I met Donald almost right away. His own executives were telling me that he was utterly incompetent and a fraud and a crook and just spilling the beans about him like crazy. In our first sit-down interview, which was in June of '88, he lied to me repeatedly. And he lied to me in a way that con artists, many of whom I've exposed, lie to people. So I immediately realized there was some substance here in what I was being told. And on July 10th, 1988, a Sunday, I was the first person to ever write about the prospect of Donald becoming president of the United States. And all these years, Michael, I have stayed with covering him just as I did with Barron Hilton, who set out to loot his father's charity and shortchange poor children, Jack Welch at General Electric, Daryl Gates, the LA police chief, and then Donald. Those are the sort of four people I thought I should pay long-term, multi-decade attention to.
All icons, all men of great stature, and who had and continue to have many who worship them, venerate them.
Yep. And looking back, I think I made good choices about who was going to be important culturally, politically, or economically.
Well, let's talk for the moment, at least, about Trump. There's much to say now, but they're trying to present the kind of unifying Trump now. This is right after Mary Trump, his niece, said, "There's nothing that redeems my uncle. I can't think of a thing." But at the same time, they're saying we're going to get maybe, especially because of the assassination attempt on him, we're going to get a different kind of character now?
I don't think so. And I don't think that the assassination attempt will have a long-term impact based on previous efforts. Every 11th American president has been assassinated, and we've had a bunch more who were shot at or hit. FDR ended up mayor of Chicago, died in 1933. Jerry Ford in San Francisco. But I don't think that the assassination attempt will have a significant impact on whether people decide to vote for Trump, not vote for Trump, and whether they're going to vote at all.
Will it have an effect on people like you who have gone after him now that he's maybe more sympathetic because he got shot at?
Well, political violence is awful and horrible, but it has been baked into America from the very beginning. You know, Donald in his speech last night, which was rambling and pretty subdued. Donald, the news media seldom reports on the fact that Donald sometimes disappears for days at a time during a campaign because he has these big mood swings. And you can see it sometimes when he has to make an appearance and you see him lumber like he's forcing himself to walk somewhere. He, in his talk last night, was not only relatively subdued, but he also made assertions like, you would think no one lived in America before the Europeans came and they just took the land, as he put it. Not mentioning that, you know, we set out to systematically kill the indigenous peoples here.
Well, in fact, let's speak about those assertions because you've certainly done a lot of investigative work with respect to the economy and taxes. There was a picture that came from his speech last night, and it's coming out in this campaign, that inflation is sky high under the Democrats, that things have gone to hell economically, the things were maybe halcyon or great during the Trump administration. Can you sort this out for us?
Yeah. When Donald assumed office, one of my friends and I co-founded a news organization called DCReport.org. I don't run it anymore, but it's still there, to cover Trump because we knew he would lie all the time and we wanted to set the record straight. So the fact is that Donald Trump brags about job creation during his presidency. Well, excluding the pandemic, let's leave that out of it. He created fewer jobs per month than Barack Obama once the Great Recession ended. Obama was about 3 percentage points more jobs than Donald Trump. He said that he had produced, the greatest economy since all time, essentially. Absolutely not true. His performance was actually a little bit below the post-World War II average. I wrote a piece giving him a grade near the end of his term, but before the pandemic, and it was a C. He asserted that the stock market had performed fabulously while he was in office. Actually not. And under Biden, it's performed fantastically. But very, very high stock market performance. And by the way, that's a consistent statistical thing in American history that I've written about. Under Democrats, if you go back to 1940, or you can choose right after the war, either one doesn't matter, more jobs are created under Democratic administrations. GDP is higher under Democratic administrations. Biden has overseen more than 500,000 jobs a month during his presidency. Trump's average was below 200,000 before the pandemic. Donald just makes stuff up, Michael. It's one of the things that I find troubling is my peers in journalism, they don't pay much attention to this. And when you ask why, answer you get is, we already reported that. Because in journalism, what you want to do is break the news, tell you something you didn't know. But once you've done that, well, we did that. We're not going to go back to it. As opposed to everybody in America knows the insurance gecko, flow, limu, emu, because advertising understands that you constantly have to put out a message to imprint it in people's brains. And Donald is unchallenged. He does not talk to any journalists, and I would say journalists with scare quotes around it, unless they're in the tank for him. He no longer takes questions from me, for example. He's not going to sit down with Peter Baker of the New York Times or someone else who's competent to ask questions. And so his just flat out lies go unchallenged.
Well, here's a question from a regular listener of ours, and I thank Reed for this question. He says, with the demise of the great newspaper syndicates, such as Knight Ridder and fewer local newspapers, wonder how people in many areas get quality journalism, and he uses the word objectivity, which maybe doesn't even apply, but he wants to know, is it hopeless?
Well, I don't know if it's hopeless. The 400-year-old model for news has been destroyed by the internet, as have some other economic models. I mean, basically, journalists are carnival barkers. Come into the tent and see the amazing two-headed woman and the Fiji mermaid. And the tent is where buyers and sellers come together. People looking for jobs, people offering jobs, people who want to buy a car, people who are selling a car. And the advertising revenue has just dissipated and gone to the internet because you don't have the costs of the intermediary, the costs of news. And I encounter people all the time who say, I say, where do you get your news? And they say, I get it from Google. There's no newsroom at Google. Google is a parasitic organization that simply collects and puts up links through an algorithm. It's all automated to news from everybody from the New York Times to the Keokuk, Iowa Gazette. And so we're not getting the depth and quality we used to have. And I'll give you my favorite simple example of this. I was writing a feature once at the LA Times, a feature. And an editor said, I want the following. And I looked at him and I said, that's going to cost more than $10,000 in expenses. And he looked at me and said, yeah, so what? That'd be today's money about $35,000. Today, if you wanted $10,000 for an investigation, you'd have to jump at every organization except the New York Times. You'd have to jump through a lot of hoops. The New York Times, where I worked for many years, is unique in that it is growing and its newsroom is bigger now than when I left in 2008. Everybody else has shriveled. My local Gannett newspaper in Rochester, New York, has gone in 25 years from 226 journalists to 26. And Knight Ridder, I worked for 2 Knight Ridder papers, and they were tough. They believed in publish and be damned, at least the Knights did. That's gone. And the courts have become very hostile to investigative reporting. So, I'm deeply concerned about how we get our information, because democracy depends on information that will fuel rational and reasoned debate rooted in facts. And instead, what we have today are many people across the political spectrum who find news sources that tell them what they want to hear or minimize news they don't want to hear. And many people don't believe anything but those news organizations. I mean, you say, well, look, here's what the Washington Post reported. Oh, well, they just lie. And I've literally had those conversations on talk radio with people. The only place you can trust is Breitbart, which is, of course, ridiculous. They just make stuff up over there.
Well, both sides are too partisan, in my humble judgment. I mean, we do have problems on that score. I mean, New York Times is still the paper of record, but there is a perceived bias in the New York Times. We had that whole flap with Tom Cotton getting an editorial in the New York Times, and the staff went nuts over that. And Barry Weiss wound up resigning and starting her own lemonade stand, so to speak.
Well, but the Tom Cotton thing resulted in the firing of James Bennett, the brother of Senator Bennett. It wasn't properly vetted or looked at, but that's the editorial page. And, my view is publishers are entitled to their views no matter what. When I was at the Los Angeles Times, there were several times I broke a big investigative piece, and the editorial that would be run would say, in essence, well, I don't know that you should pay that much attention to what was reported on the front page Sunday. And that's fine. It's the owner's paper, and the owner gets to do what they want on the opinion page. The problem with the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal is they don't understand how to cover a con artist. And that's what Donald Trump is. He is the most successful con artist by far in the history of the world. If you cover him as a politician, you miss who he is and what he is doing. And the conventional rules of journalism produce the coverage you're seeing now, and they don't focus on the things that, as a con man, he's up to and he has done. And I think this is a real problem, is how you look at the individual. Joe Kahn, the gazillionaire executive editor of the New York Times, who's the son of a gazillionaire, so he's always grown up in an exceptionally wealthy family. The news play under his leadership, especially the last month or so, strikes me as very troublesome in tone and out of touch. And I'm in a discussion group with retired New York Times people, a couple thousand of us, and boy, is there a lot of upset and a feeling that the standards of the paper have been lowered since Joe Kahn became the executive editor.
Question from one of our listeners in Omaha, Nebraska. Penny wants to know, New York Times moved to subscription early on. Could everyone have done that? How could subscription models affect the news?
Well, the New York Times revenue right now is a fraction of what it was. Advertising that's digital brings in about 20 cents on the dollar compared to print advertising. But the Times is in a unique position with a worldwide audience. This isn't going to help the Chicago Tribune and the Philadelphia Inquirer and the LA Times and the Sacramento Bee, regional newspapers and smaller metro market newspapers. Everybody is down. In fact, the New Yorker reported the other day that apparently 7% of all the working newspaper journalists in America today are employed at the New York Times. That's not a good thing. That is not at all a good thing. The Times was flailing at this, and I was an in-house critic when I went to a meeting back not long after Google started up, where an editor said, "We're making money off Google." And I interrupted, and I said, "Excuse me, I have no doubt your accounting system tells you you're making money off Google. Google is eating your lunch. And if you don't understand that, I'll be glad to sit here for an hour and explain what I call the universal ledger. There's financial ledgers, financial accounting, and then there's the universal ledger where all costs are accounted for." And the Times ultimately woke up to this. They hired Mark Thompson, who had revitalized the BBC, who's now revitalizing CNN. And he came in and showed them how to have a financially viable path to the future. But it's not true for anybody else. The LA Times, where I worked for many years also, when I was there, daily circulation was 1.1 million. It's apparently now around 90,000.
Well, if you are right, David, and Trump is the greatest con man of all time, how are so many people being taken in by him? Is the culpability with the newspapers and the media for not really being able to read him, as you say, a con man, or are there other institutions that are really failing and not doing the job?
Well, I think that news organizations aren't responsible for people who get taken by the con man. They're responsible for not properly exposing. Donald has had support from three fundamental and overlapping groups of people. The largest and most important one is the bottom 90% of Americans. I wrote 3 books about how government policies that basically nobody knew about have ravaged the bottom 90% of Americans. In 2016, on average, people in the bottom 90% only got paid on their jobs through the end of November. In addition, healthcare, which in 1973 was almost always a fringe benefit on top of your pay, was turned into a deduction from your paycheck. The same thing happened with retirement money, whether it's a pension or a 401k plan. It's not on top of your pay, it comes out of your pay. And housing costs went up relative to the economy somewhat. So the reality in 2016, 90% of Americans basically only got paid until about October 20th. They're hurting terribly. They don't have savings. Everyone knows that your job is in danger. Even tenured university professors have their jobs in danger these days because we've broken down the social contract. Companies used to, keep people on when the economy was down. Now they just fire them left and right. And so for this group of Americans, there's a state of economic fear and for some of them outright terror. And they don't understand what's happening. I don't expect them to read my books. They were bestsellers, but that's a few 100,000 copies in a country of over 300 million people. The second group of people are those who have been quiet about it because it's a threat to their social position or their job, but who are furious about the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement. There are millions of Americans who do not want to sit next to a Latino in the airplane. They don't want to have an Asian in the cockpit, and God forbid they have to report to a black woman boss. And Donald Trump has peeled off the veneer of civility and given permission for people to express their anger and their hatred. And you'll hear the phrase, "That black man got my job." I don't know where you get the idea that it was your job. It was a job, and somebody else got it. But that's the second group. The third group are people I call faux, F-A-U-X, fake Christians. And these are people who embrace Donald Trump's stated life philosophy, which is one word, revenge. If there's anything that the New Testament totally and completely rejects without equivocation, it is revenge. You're to turn the other cheek. And there have been a number of news reports of pastors saying that their flocks have come to them and said, why are you teaching this turn the other cheek? We want Trump's religious teachings. We want hit them hard in the face, get revenge, get retribution, ruin the lives of those terrible people. And so I don't think these people are Christians by any measure, even though they, of course, insist they are. You put those three groups together and they don't perfectly overlap, but if it's a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap, and you end up with the people who revere Donald Trump. And it's easy to find on the internet. People will tell you that he is God's anointed messenger. The shooting has led many of these people to say that was God who reached out and moved the bullet so it wouldn't kill him. Magical thinking.
Well, he said God is on our side, and he made that very clear. Here's Jerry from Aurora, one of our more conservative listeners, who says, in just a few minutes, you have spoken ill of Trump, Breitbart, and journalists who interview Trump. Yet no one is calling for Trump to withdraw, while many Democrats are calling for Biden to withdraw. Also, you believe Biden's uncle was eaten by cannibals? I'm not sure how that fits in, but...
I don't know anything about the cannibal story, but actually there are a lot of people who want Donald Trump to withdraw. There is a whole Republican movement that wishes he would go away. But every Republican office holder that I know of who stood up to him has been voted out of office. Trump has such total control of the Republican Party that, according to today's New York Times, when the party platform committee met recently, all their cell phones were taken from them and put into bags that don't allow communication. And they were told point blank, this is the platform you will approve. And it was passed with some dissents, but it was passed very quickly. And it was an indication that the Republican Party, and I was a registered Republican for 25 years, the Republican Party is now the cult party of one man, Donald Trump. But absolutely, there are Republicans who want Trump out of the race. Look at the Lincoln Project, the ads that they've been doing. And Trump only got about 75 to 80% of the votes in contested primaries, an indication that many people are very uncomfortable with Trump.
But Jerry's question brings up another notion in my mind. That is, there's been a lot of talk from critics of Trump like you about Trump being not only a con man, but a criminal and comporting himself like a mob boss, that sort of thing. But they also have come back now, the Trump supporters and many of those in his minions, talking about the Biden crime family. I mean, it's almost as if there's an equation there. Do you see any of that as making sense or being plausible?
Well, there's an effort to create that. So let's look at the difference between the two presidents. Donald Trump pardoned Paul Manafort, who was on the payroll of the Russian government directly and indirectly. He pardoned other people who had done favors for him, and he has made it pretty clear he intends to pardon, if he gets back to the White House, the people who tried to overthrow our government 3 years ago. Joe Biden, when he came in as president, new presidents routinely replace all 90 United States attorneys. They're the local prosecutors. He replaced 89 of them and left the one who was investigating his son, Hunter Biden, in place. When that prosecutor asked for more authority, he was given it. When he asked to be made a special counsel like Jack Smith, which gave him greater authority, he was given it. Hunter Biden was taken to trial. He was convicted. The charges he was convicted on, almost nobody is ever prosecuted for. I often write about how we only have about 500 convictions a year in this country for tax fraud, and they're almost always drug dealers, bribe payers, or bribe takers. And if you paid the taxes, which Hunter Biden did, you just don't get prosecuted. Well, you know, the law was more harsh on Hunter Biden perhaps than is standard, but so what? Joe Biden stood back and let the system operate. He didn't interfere in it as Donald does. There is zero evidence that Joe Biden has done anything illegal. The members of Congress who asserted this first of all, only held closed-door hearings. If you had real evidence, why did you hold open hearings? It turned out of the two witnesses they had, and that's all they had, one has now been arrested as a Chinese spy for the communist dictatorship in Beijing, and the other one was an agent of the Kremlin. That's completely different from Donald's life. Donald is a convicted felon. He's been found to be a rapist under New York law after a trial before a federal judge. He has, throughout his life, and I've documented this in 3 books and thousands of articles, he's cheated investors, workers, vendors, some of whom he put out of business. He's plied 12-year-old children with liquor because they had money to gamble. He, for a decade, was involved up to his eyeballs with a twice convicted criminal who was one of the biggest cocaine traffickers in America, and he did extraordinary and inexplicable favors for this guy, Joe Wexelbaum, which I've written about in my books. So there's no comparison here. Donald is the 3rd generation head of a 4-generation white-collar crime family. They don't break legs or kill people. They make money by lying to you, making promises they don't intend to keep, not complying with contracts. And this is not unique to Trump. There are a whole bunch of white-collar criminals in America, and I've argued, and will probably at some point write a serious piece about how we need to reform white-collar criminal law because it's too easy to get away with stealing from people through contracts and broken promises.
Which prompts me to ask you about the cases that are now involving Trump. But before I do that, by the way, we invite your questions. Here's Henry from Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for the question, Henry. He wants to know how much of Trump support is related to federal judge appointments. Because I don't know if you saw the new New Yorker cover. It has all of Trump's faces except for 3 justices, the 3 women on the court. So all of the other justices are Trump justices, according to this cartoon, which may or may not be fair. But in many respects, with this immunity ruling, and we can talk about that as well, it does seem to be like the court is standing up, or if not the Supreme Court, certainly Eileen Cannon and the documents case, which many felt was perhaps the best case against Trump of the 4, although in Alvin Bragg's aegis, he came to be convicted, as you pointed out, as a felon.
Yes.
I want to talk about those cases, but first to Henry's question, how much of his support is related to judge appointments in your judgment?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who support Trump because they want a judiciary that will achieve some result that they want. For example, a national ban on abortions. And there's a variety of views people have there from, well, if the woman dies, it doesn't matter. Abortion is wrong, to, yes, we should ban abortions, but have exceptions for rape and incest. I mean, there's a spectrum there, but it's a pretty narrow spectrum. But I think there are a lot of people who want to have a federal judiciary that will be hostile to administrative government. We live in a very complex world. So we have these administrative agencies with highly trained experts, people with doctoral degrees in biology and geography and other fields, because that's what we need to have a safe, stable society. But there are a lot of people who are deeply offended by that and believe, for example, that we should eliminate all regulation of the stock markets because markets will ultimately correct themselves. And you know what? They're right about that. But they could also bring down the entire economy beforehand. I mean, the reason we have regulation is most people aren't saints.
Oh, no, you're taking away one of my deepest illusions, David.
I think most people generally are well motivated. We don't need to worry about them, but there are lots and lots of people who see nothing wrong with swindling you, with selling adulterated products, and they'll defend it. And I've written about people like this where, they're in prison and they keep defending, well, I didn't do anything wrong.
Maybe I can get you on record here to talk about J.D. Vance, who someone not kindly referred to as a proven bootlicking, talked about his proven bootlicking skills. I mean, he was comparing Donald Trump to Hitler. He was right on board with your kind of criticism, morality and so forth. And then he ran for the Senate in Ohio and suddenly he changed completely. And now he's all in as far as MAGA is concerned. How to explain, is that Trump's power? Is that Trump's ability to simply establish that kind of power? How do you read that?
Yeah, J.D. Vance has demonstrated that he has no moral principles. He called Trump cultural heroin, among other things. And on a number of issues, he has changed his views depending on who he's trying to curry the favor of or who is financially supporting his campaign. And in that sense, he's very much like Donald. I mean, Donald once told me, I asked him, what do you think about American healthcare? And he stopped and said, it should be like the roads. When you need it, you just use it. And I said, so not toll roads. He said, no, you need it, you just use it. Now, of course, he wants to destroy the Affordable Care Act because Obama did it. That makes it bad. And you remember he kept saying he had a new healthcare plan, a beautiful plan. We're going to repeal and replace with a beautiful plan. Never came up with a plan. J.D. Vance represents a younger version of this kind of approach to politics. Most people don't have the time or the knowledge to deeply take apart political issues. And I'm not saying they're dumb. All you have to do is walk into any blue-collar bar in America and listen to people when there's some play by an umpire or a referee, and the detailed analysis that people sitting around the bar will have about baseball or football or basketball and the rules. It's that politics is not central to their existence. And Donald understands that. He's very visceral, and so does J.D. Vance. He appeals to people on a visceral level and hopes they don't pay attention to the fact that many of the things he's saying have no basis in reality.
Well, there's one thing where the two still maybe don't come together, and that is on an issue which is going to be the strongest still for the Democrats, I suspect, and that's abortion. Former President Trump is talking about the states deciding. J.D. Vance is on record as saying incest or rape should still no abortion be allowed.
Well, this is an issue where Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are going to have to muddy the waters, because it's crystal clear that the vast majority of Americans, and depending on how you ask the question, as high as close to 90%, believe essentially that reproductive rights are between you and your doctor. Project 2025, which Trump is trying to distance himself from, even though before it began, he said, these are the people writing my plan. It's written by his people. He's mentioned in it more than 300 times. One of the things it proposes is that no contraceptives, not the plan B for after sex, not condoms, not IUDs, not the pill. None of those could be shipped by common carrier. Now, I think most people, if they read the report, would go, common carrier, what's that? That means if you had your own truck, Michael Krasny condoms, we have our own fleet of trucks, you can deliver to the stores. But if you call up Schneider, the big trucking company, and say, I got a quarter load for one of your trucks or a tenth of a load, you can't do that. That's a common carrier. And this would effectively bar contraception in America. I don't see how that's a winning strategy with anybody under the age of 50. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but they're hoping people don't really understand that. And as with the abortion issue, what they want to do is leave it muddied and not be crystal clear. And that is one of Donald's great powers and strengths. He takes something where the issues are just crystal clear, and he figures out how to muddy the waters. And on this point, Michael, about Project 2025, he said, I haven't seen it. I don't know anything about what's in it. But, there are parts of it I like and there are parts of it I don't like. Well, I'm sorry. If you haven't seen it or read it, how do you know what you like and don't like? He's just lying.
Have you seen Project 2025?
I've read the thing.
And?
I think that it is an effort to create an authoritarian state that would take away many of the liberties of the people, which is the key reason we created this country, to see if by ennobling and setting free the human spirit, what we could achieve. And this would impose, I believe it would lead to imposing a theocracy or something close to it. It wants to have religious studies in our public schools. It would absolutely tear down any separation of church and state. And our Constitution is very clear. In Article 6, I believe, there will be no religious test for any office, and you have the freedom to believe or not believe in your religion. And the limits we place are very minimal. I mean, if you want to revive an ancient religion where you sacrifice virgins on an altar and take their beating hearts out, that's still going to be a crime. You can revive the religion, but you can't put a knife to somebody. You can't even raise it over them. But this Project 2025, there's very good analyses you can find of it on the internet. It clearly is designed to increase the power of the presidency, dramatically increase military spending, cut support for the poor, for people who are elderly, who are disabled, and to provide the wealthiest people in America with even more wealth at the expense of those who can't fight back: children, the disabled, the elderly, the old, the sick.
This is Heritage Foundation ideology, essentially, isn't it?
It is. And the Heritage Foundation, when it was started, held itself out to be a think tank and a serious examiner of issues. And it has, over time, morphed more and more into simply, this is the ideology that we favor, and we're going to try to figure out how to impose it upon you. I think a lot of the economic ideas in the report are pretty nutty. I'm going to write about that soon. Donald has suggested that we eliminate the income tax and we finance the government with tariffs, which we did in the early days of our republic. Well, a tariff is a tax on goods you consume that come from another country, and it's a tax on domestically produced goods, because if the tariff raises the price of a car by $10,000, a domestic manufacturer can raise their price $9,900 and reap extra profits. And the income tax is paid mostly by people whose income is way beyond any need to consume. So I think that this would be bad for everybody who isn't already rich. It would be very bad for strivers.
Well, it prompts me to ask you, the argument has been, certainly from the Republicans, the GOP in general, that if you cut taxes for those who are very affluent, it sort of trickles down. You create more jobs.
Yeah.
How does David Cay Johnston see that?
Michael, I've been analyzing these government data and writing about them. I mean, there are some critics out there who have written to me and written articles saying the reason we're having this phony debate about inequality is David Cay Johnston. It's his horrible reporting in the New York Times. Everything I write about this comes from the official government data and my analysis of it. And it's very clear at this point that trickle-down economics, it doesn't exist. It's Amazon up economics. We have a huge hidden stealth systems to extract money from you and redistribute it upwards. My favorite example of this is if you could get everybody in America to give you a penny a day, get a regulation from the government. Everybody in America has to give Michael Krasny a penny a day. At the end of the year, you'd have more than $1.2 billion. Well, we have an industry, oil and gas pipelines, which are very efficient ways to move fossil fuels, but they are exempt from the corporate income tax. And yet the rates that these monopolies and their regulated monopolies charge don't just include the income tax that the corporations have to pay. They include what's called the gross up of the tax, because when they give you enough money to pay the tax, now you've made more money, you have to pay tax on that. So they are collecting, by my calculation, over $3 billion a year. A couple of congressmen from oil states demanded a study to show I was wrong. And a study was done by the Joint Committee on Taxation, and they concluded that it's $2 billion a year. But that money goes to 175 companies, and the investors don't even get the money. It's raked off by the executives and controlling shareholders. So here's a system that moves $2 billion, $3 billion, take your pick, from all of us when we buy gasoline or we heat water for coffee on the stove, to this narrow group of people. Now, what do you think the odds are, Michael, that we could go out and get people to organize and oppose this? Let's fight the 3 penny a day ripoff. Not going to happen.
Not even with your charisma, I think.
No. And there are hundreds of these devices that I described in one of the books behind me, Free Lunch. The subsidies that companies get. Many large companies now get their capital for investment, not from Wall Street, but from your tax dollars.
This is a comment from Reed again, who says, the right seems to want the judiciary to make policy. Thank you for that comment. I'll let it stand. And Jerry, maybe from the other side of the political spectrum, this is fascinating to get these polarities, says, very simply, do you support the assertion from Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, and many others that Trump is a Russian agent and Hunter Biden's laptop was a Russian plant?
Well, Donald Trump is an asset to the Russian government. That doesn't mean he's an agent. Those are terms of art that have different meaning. The Russians have been courting Donald since 1987. And in June of 2015, right after Donald Trump announced his latest bid for president, remember he made an effort in 2000, there was an email sent to John Jr. saying that the Kremlin wants to help you beat Hillary Clinton. And a little over a week later, there was a meeting at Trump Tower attended by Trump's campaign manager, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Don Jr., and I think there was one of the first in the room, where these Kremlin emissaries came. Now,
I think Manafort was there, I think, too. Right?
And Manafort, who was his campaign manager, and who was on the payroll of the Russians and other evil people around the world for years. Donald Jr. lied and denied about this for almost a year until the New York Times got the emails. If you're in a presidential campaign and any foreign government, especially a hostile government like Russia, says we want to help you, there is only one thing you do if you're a patriotic American. You pick up the phone, you call the FBI, and you say, I need to speak to someone in counterintelligence. They didn't do that. And Donald has had numerous transactions that I've written about, and so have some other people, that make no economic sense unless they were putting money into Donald's pocket. And what does Donald say about people who put money in his pocket? Why shouldn't I like them?
Well, he wanted to build a hotel in Moscow. I mean,
yes, but that's just part of it. When he built Trump Tower, one man showed up, a Russian, to buy 5 apartments. He literally brought cash. I don't mean a check. I mean dollar bills in luggage. And if you wanted to buy an apartment in New York when Trump Tower went up in 1983, the end of 83, you would have had to establish your bona fides. What's your income? Where do you work? We're going to investigate you before you can move into our building. Except at 2 buildings, one of which was Trump Tower. And so Trump Tower was suddenly filled with criminals from all over the world. Interpol and the New York Police Department's Organized Crime Bureau paid very close attention to that building because it was full of mobsters. Russians ran a full-blown 24-hour-a-day casino on the floor directly under Donald Trump's apartment. And when they got busted, Trump said, I had no idea. You can't get up to the high floors in that elevator without Donald knowing about it. If he didn't know, which I believe he did, then it was willful blindness at not looking at it. A full-blown illegal casino, and he's in the casino business in New Jersey.
What about the Hunter Biden laptop, though? What's your take on that, particularly since you had a lot of intelligence officers saying it was a Russian plant? Well,
first off, let me tell you, I've written nothing about that, okay? I mean, you can't do everything. I don't write about Paris Opera either. Hunter Biden was out there trying to profit off daddy. There's no question about it. Just like Billy Carter did and Donald Nixon, Nixon's brother. And, there were people willing to throw money at him because they believed it would get them something. There's no evidence they got anything. And as to the rest of the stuff about his laptop, Michael, I don't know enough about it to talk about it. It's on the edge of what I've been doing. But look, the system dealt with Hunter Biden. His prosecution went forward. He's been convicted. And by the way, Biden says there's no way he will pardon his son.
He says that, and yet one wonders if that is something that he will. This is assuming that Joe Biden runs for re-election and assuming he's re-elected, because he loves his son. And
he didn't say he might not grant clemency, that is, letting him out of jail early, but he said flatly, "I will not pardon my son."
Well, what do you make of the 4 cases against Trump now? As I said earlier, the one that seems to make the most sense in most people's minds is documents. These are national security documents. One wonders what Trump was doing with them to begin with. But Aileen Cannon comes out and says Jack Smith appointed special prosecutor. It's not constitutional. And now you have at least one case where felony has been found. Is there going to be a sentence? Unlikely, I would say. I don't know what your take is on it. But a lot of people are hoping that some of these cases are going to result in some kind of something punitive or something against Trump. Seems like the delaying is going to go on and maybe there's going to be no consequences.
Well, Merrick Garland waited 2 years before he authorized a special prosecutor, and that's just a terrible judgment on his part. He should have gotten onto this right away. let me go to the case where Donald Trump is a convicted felon. Before he became president, he engaged in this criminal scheme to corrupt the presidential election in New York State by paying off Stormy Daniels.
The hush money.
And right. But it's not hush money so much as to corrupt the election. I think the news media have mischaracterized this. The purpose was to corrupt the election. And he did this before he was president. The only thing that under this cockamamie Supreme Court decision giving broad immunity to presidents that he could claim is that the checks that he wrote after he became president in the cover-up scheme aren't covered. Well, that would still leave close to 30 charges against him. And there's no way that someone running for president has any immunity as president. That's absurd. And yet the Judge Marchand seems to think that he may not be able to sentence Donald. I wrote a piece for the New York Daily News 2 years ago saying there was a much better criminal charge to bring against Donald. In 1984, Donald fabricated 2 non-existent businesses and took $600,000 in losses. He was tried twice for income tax fraud. He lost both cases, city and state, and his own lawyer testified against him and effectively accused him of forgery. Well, Donald, in the last 5 years, the tax returns the Democrats made public, created about 60 fictitious businesses and did the same thing. Convicting him would be a slam dunk if ever there was a slam dunk because you have criminal intent. He was told, don't do this, and he continued to do it. In the 2 federal cases, if Donald gets back into the White House, he'll dismiss them. They're both very strong cases. And the documents case, Special Prosecutor Jack Smith has repeatedly put in hypotheticals in his filings. Imagine if a former president were to take documents and monetize them in this way, or were to provide them to such and such people. And those aren't idle speculations. They're putting into the record as hypotheticals things that they think or know for a fact that Trump did. And because it's national security, you and I will be 100 years in the grave, perhaps, before we find out what actually happened, because, we still have secrets from World War II that are locked up. And Judge Cannon, in her very first order, said Donald Trump deserves special treatment. That is such an offense to our Constitution. No one is special treatment. We are all equal under the law, that she should have been removed right then. And she may now be removed by the 11th Circuit. But what will happen is Trump will then appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and heaven only knows what the 6 justices that are in Donald's pocket will do.
Well, if Marchand sends him to prison, which seems unlikely, or says he has to do time, does he take all the Secret Service with him?
Well, nothing would prevent, and I was the first person to say this, Michael, nothing would prevent a United States president from serving while in prison. He can do his duties from prison. And there's and when I first said that on, I think it was CNN, the other guest, who's a lawyer, sort of rolled his eyes, and within 48 hours, there were people out every hour saying, yeah, you could be, none of them crediting me, saying, yeah, you can be president while you're in prison. Now, it would only apply to state prison, not federal, because Donald could pardon. If he couldn't pardon himself, and I don't think it would be legitimate for a president to pardon himself, because he can order you murdered, pardon himself for the crime, order me murdered, pardon himself for the crime. But he certainly could grant clemency. If you accept a pardon, that is a confession of guilt under a 1925 Supreme Court decision called Burdick. If you get clemency and they say, get out of the prison, you don't have an option. You have to go.
I want to talk a little bit more with you about Secret Service, since I brought it up with respect to the possibility of the former president serving time in prison. But I'm interested in finding out your thoughts about where this is going to go ultimately. I mean, does he essentially have control of the court now? Is it in his pocket? And what about the immunity ruling?
The immunity ruling is an abomination. It creates law. It isn't calling balls and strikes, as Chief Justice Roberts says the court's supposed to do. It is speculative about the future. It's just a horrible decision that I don't think will stand when we get, if and when we get a different court and a case comes along to undo this. President of the United States should be accountable for everything he's done. Nobody less than Mitch McConnell said that in January of 2021. that Donald Trump is accountable in criminal justice for what he did. And now you asked about the Secret Service.
Well, I'm interested in what may have gone wrong. I mean, we have someone in charge.
Got it.
There's some misogyny, I think, in some of the criticism that's come out against the head of the Secret Service, who happens to be a woman. But aside from that, it seems like she may have been irresponsible, or at least didn't take the kind of precautions that one would assume would be necessary.
So one of the lessons I've learned in more than 50 years of doing investigations is what seems obvious in the beginning, at the end, may be completely wrong. There are a number of citizens who tried to get the attention of law enforcement, saying, look at this guy climbing up on the roof. It's entirely possible that those law enforcement people and Secret Service people misinterpreted what they were doing. They couldn't necessarily hear their voices, and Secret Service people in particular are trained, you're to watch from here to here for suspicious activity. You're not supposed to let anyone divert you from that. And we may find out that that is what happened. Clearly, there were poor judgment in not having this line of sight roof about 390 feet from the podium under surveillance, or having a law enforcement person on that roof. And we'll find out. There'll be an official investigation. And what you should watch for is that it is a minute by minute, second by second recounting of what happened. That's what the investigation into the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms people in the Waco disaster showed. Whereas the investigation of the FBI's role in the same thing is, we couldn't figure this out, and it was too hard to tell what was going on. That is, the investigator, S.G. Dennis, for the FBI case was in the bag. The ones who did the ATF side of it, they were just tough as nails in tying everything down.
Speaking of investigations, I wanted to ask you, I've always meant to ask you, Rachel Maddow got some information from you about a tax return, a couple of tax returns that you had access to. And I've never heard her publicize and promote like she did those tax returns. I mean, almost all day, you've got to hear about this and so forth. There wasn't a whole lot that came out in that, I mean, Trump actually, it turned out, paid some taxes and didn't pay some other taxes and so forth. But I have to tell you, it was sort of overplayed, inflated, in my judgment.
Yes, I was disappointed. I got her the biggest rating she's ever had, and she's never had me on again, by the way. Not once since then.
Because she probably felt she overpromoted it, and she was right. She did overpromote it.
Yeah, and what people missed is this. Donald appeared to have paid a significant tax rate. But under the regular, we have two tax systems, alternative and regular. Under the regular tax system, Donald paid a lower rate than the poorest Americans, the poorest half. They made about $300 a week and paid a little over 3.5% to the federal government. Donald made over about $3 million a week, and he paid less than 3.5%, lower rate than the poor. He paid something else called the alternative minimum tax. If you are a real estate person, that's just a zero interest loan to the government that you get back as soon as you have tax losses to take against it. So that got completely lost here, that Donald only paid a lower rate than the poorest American. And that's because tax is, I believe, having, won a Pulitzer Prize and been a finalist 3 times for writing about tax and been a columnist for Tax Analyst magazine, tax is deliberately made beyond normal human understanding by Congress and lobbyists so that people can't figure it out. My next book will propose a much simpler tax system that gets rid of all of these favors for people at the top, and which is almost cheat-proof. The only way you'd be able to cheat is through a multi-person criminal conspiracy with rather draconian results for you if you engage in it.
Well, not to sound too skeptical, but what do you make out of the fact that there are probably a lot of Americans who champion the idea that someone like Trump doesn't pay any taxes or pays a very low amount of taxes?
I find that to be one of the most astonishing aspects of American culture. I have had people say to me, good for Donald, he didn't pay any taxes. And I'm like, you realize that means you had to pay more. Good for Donald. And where's your basic fundamental morality? The reason we have accomplished what we have in this country is taxes. Here's something we don't teach in the schools. I teach my law students. What number republic do we live in? The second. The first republic under the Articles of Confederation had no power to tax. We replaced it. And why did we replace it with the U.S. Constitution? For the specific purpose of taxing ourselves and regulating commerce, which is a kind of tax. We don't teach people that we created this country so we could tax ourselves, and yet it is essential to this country.
But I think, David, that there are a lot of people who resent liberals and therefore they like Trump and they think he's taking shit, or they resent the media. A lot of people resent the IRS and they feel the IRS is against them and they're adverse to him.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you about that. The IRS are the tax police. That's the first thing to keep in mind. They're no different than the cops on the street in uniform, from the Wall Street police at the SEC, from the Food and Drug Police at the FDA. They're just police, and they're carrying out the instructions given to them by Congress, and they're terrible instructions, and they have a terrible task, okay? But taxes, a government without taxes is no government at all. A government is its taxes. And if we want a strong, vibrant country where we protect people's civil liberties, where we have the money to educate people, and where we have the infrastructure, the commonwealth goods and services, so that anybody can create wealth, that requires a strong tax system. If you just want only the rich to continue to be rich, then you should be very upset about paying taxes.
What about those who say that, and you kind of indicated this a little bit ago, that the tax system that we have presently is too enigmatic and too Byzantine and crazy. And not only that, but people kind of get messed up because not only don't they understand it, but often they get taxed for things that they shouldn't be taxed for.
Yep. And I've had this happen to me, and I understand how infuriating it is when that happens. And that's why we need to get rid of all this filigree. I mean, the reason our tax code in the official version is almost 4,000 pages is favors. Congress put in a favor for you or the guy down the street or somebody against their competitor, and this shouldn't be there. And I've literally written about one change in the tax code, which isn't even in the tax code. It's in a whole different law that drove a man to murder. And why was it there? Because IBM wanted a tax break, and the only way to finance it was to come up with $50 million, which is bupkis in our $24 trillion economy. And it drove this man crazy, as it did other people. I've never met anybody who will defend our tax system as it is. I certainly would not. So instead of grousing about it, I set out years ago to write a new tax code. It has been gone over by numerous experts, tax administrators, business owners, tax lawyers, tax accountants. Every one of them agrees my system would work, and they also agree on something else. The wealthiest people in the country and corporations will set out to kill it because they don't pay taxes. They make a profit off the taxes. And when I reported that 25 years ago in the New York Times, the Times was flooded with calls and letters. This guy's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Again, a congressional study was ordered. And on my shelf up here is a 3-volume, 1,800-page study that says I'm right. Lots of corporations really turn a profit off the income tax system, but financial accounting rules make it appear they pay taxes when they actually make a profit.
You've been right about a lot of things. Of course, there are people who take issue with you on Trump and all the rest. But anything that comes to mind if I ask you, have you ever been really wrong about something that you regret?
Well, I made one career error. I wrote a column that Fox, the parent of Fox News, had gotten a $5 billion tax refund. The company, which I asked about this, and they had nothing to say about it, had changed its policy on formatting positive and negative numbers. And it was on a page 1073 of a government document. And it didn't say we were making positive numbers negative and negative numbers positive. It just said we've changed the formatting of our numbers without explanation. And I got that wrong. And it was a big embarrassment. And I immediately corrected it. I mean, as soon as I established that I was wrong, within an hour, we took the story down and I wrote a mea culpa. But everything else that I've written in my career has stood up. My exposés of the LAPD, of how they had undercover officers overseas and the police chief was assigning officers to sleep with women to spy on them. My stories about how Jack Welch was ruining and ripping off GE. Lots of things that I wrote at the time were so far ahead of the curve that maybe a decade went by before somebody caught up with it. One of my colleagues at the LA Times once said that I had an incurable case of premature articulation. And one of the things, Michael, I am the only I've written press criticism for almost my whole career. I am the only journalist in American history who has caused a broadcast chain, an extraordinarily profitable broadcast chain, to shut down and go out of business because of what today we call fake news. So I've been out there policing my own profession for almost my entire career.
And that broadcast chain was?
Called Gross Telecasting. They owned a station called WJIM, and the owner was blacking people out, ordering that people who wouldn't do his economic bidding be made to look bad. And when it was all over, it took 11 years, the mayor of Lansing, Michigan, said to me, so it turns out that Harold Gross, the controlling owner, Harold Gross did every single thing the Detroit Free Press accused him of, and a whole lot more. And his punishment is he gets to sell his station and walk away with $48 million. Ain't American justice grand?
Oh boy, on that note, you have had quite a storied career, and I certainly give you kudos for so much that you've added to our understanding and that you continue to. And before I say goodbye officially, let me thank all of those who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to live every Friday at 11 a.m. at Pacific Time, or on Apple, Spotify, or on our website, graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, I do invite you to join by going to the website at graymatter.show, and you can find previous episodes there. That's Gray with an E. Also invite you to send any reactions or suggestions or recommendations you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And let's thank our great Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Colin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to our special guest, David Cay Johnston. Good to see you, sir. Good to have you with us.
Thank you, Michael.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.